know people will continue to trickle in as we start this conversation, but I think I'd just like to say hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Katie Koca Polite, and I am Assistant Curator here at Krannert Art Museum. Today's conversation will discuss the labor history and notions of gender during the Great Depression, which are related to themes found in KAM's current exhibition, Pressing Issues, Printmaking as Social Justice in 1930s United States. The exhibition is on view through December 23rd, and it brings together work by artists in the 1930s who, through their art, produced critical commentaries on the social injustices plaguing the country at their time. Before I introduce the other speakers, I want to announce just a few things, a few business things. First of all, this conversation is being recorded, and it will be uploaded to KAM's website for future viewings. Please keep your video and microphone off during the conversation. That helps with our bandwidth. And the discussion is closed captioned, so if you look at the bottom of your screen and you would like live closed captioning, you can click on the little CC button down below. And if you have any questions throughout this discussion, please feel free to enter them into the chat box, which is also down below. It's the little thought bubble. You can type that in, and some moderator will look through those questions and we'll address those at the end. And lastly, I'd just like to thank you all for joining us virtually in a pre-pandemic time. We would be in the galleries, you know, fully immersed with the art and creating meaningful dialogue in front of it. And I hope that we can all safely do this again in the near future. So thank you again. Krannert Art Museum, as part of the University of Illinois, stands on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Muscatine, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these indigenous nations prior to their forced removal, and they continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity today. As part of a land-grant institution dedicated to promoting the critical power of art of the past and present, Krannert Art Museum has a responsibility to acknowledge the people of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this university over the last 150 years. We also recognize the particular role images have played in this history. Using our collections, programming, and collaborative relationships, we seek to address and reflect on these histories and the role that the U of I continues to play in shaping them. So I'm happy to introduce our speakers today. Emily Twarog is Associate Professor of History and Labor Studies at the School of Labor and Employment Relations, as well as the Director of the Regina V. Polk Women's Labor Leadership Conference. She earned her doctorate in American History at the University of Illinois in Chicago and a Master's in Labor Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst's Labor Resource and Research Center. Emily's book, Politics in the Pantry, Housewives, Food, and Consumer Protest in 20th Century America, was published by Oxford University Press in 2017, and it examines the ways in which housewives in America used food protests as political tools to gain political influence both locally and nationally. She's also the author of several articles and book chapters related to the evolution of working class women's leadership development, as well as gender violence in the workplace. Particularly interesting in relation to the upcoming election, Emily authored the essay, The Ghost of Elections Past, Present, and Future, Gender and Racism in Electoral Politics, which was published in the Labor Studies Journal in 2017. Thank you, Emily, for joining. Stephanie Fortado is lecturer in the Labor Education Program, providing workshops and extension programming for unions and the general public on the on the Champaign-Urbana campus and throughout Illinois. As part of her job, Stephanie is the co-director of the annual Regina V. Polk Women's Labor Leadership Conference. Before joining the university, she served as the executive director of the Illinois Labor History Society, the oldest statewide labor history not-for-profit in the United States. Stephanie is a social and cultural historian of the modern United States, with a focus on African-American working class and social movement history. She is especially interested in civil rights and Black power history, and in labor history, especially as it relates to women's history, environmental history, and urban history. Her first book is forthcoming, tentatively titled Race, Recreation, and Rebellion, The Black Freedom Movement in Urban Parks in Cleveland, Ohio, 1945 to 1977. And thank you, Stephanie, for joining. So one last thing before we get started, I thought it might be nice to kind of give you a sense of the works in the space. I'll try and do a very brief stroll through in case you can't actually make it to the museum in person, and then we'll get started with the questions. So again, we'll just kind of walk through and then we'll start talking. We're going to go to the other part of the gallery. And these are just works that are focusing more on issues of labor. There are two other sections that I'm not showing you right now, but that information will be uploaded onto CAM's website at a future date. So that was the quick little brief walkthrough. So again, we can start the conversation. I'm going to share my screen with a PowerPoint presentation. And so Stephanie and Emily, let me know when you want me to move the slides forward. But I'd really just like to start off the conversation with a broad understanding of labor during the Great Depression. So the majority of the prints included in Pressing Issues were produced under the Work Progress Administration, its Federal Art Project, which was a relief program for visual artists under President Roosevelt's New Deal that he enacted during the Great Depression. While highlighting everyday experiences of the working class, some of which they personally experienced, the artists critique various social injustices through their prints, including commentaries on labor conditions. There are artists who focused on strikes and unions, child labor, the bleak and unsafe conditions of sweatshops and coal mining, the psychological strife caused by industrial work, the effects of work insecurity, among others. Although the Great Depression was a period of extreme economic hardship, can you expand on some of the positive policy or legislative changes that occurred during the 1930s, specifically relating to labor? And I will share my screen now. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay, thanks.
I guess I'll start. So yeah, I think that what is often maybe not remembered about the 1930s is that while the Great Depression was going on, it was one of the greatest times of labor militancy in the United States. So then two of the prints that really stood out to me, if you want to forward through the next two slides, in really sort of capture this idea of the different kind of issues that workers were trying to fight for. So for this one, and then the next one, which is of a protest in front of a house, a strike protest. And I think that these two prints really sort of capture the labor actions that were going on at the time. And when we do think about labor in the 1930s, we often think about sit down strikes and auto working plants, things like that, which are very in popular remembrances are very masculine, right? But also women were very much at the front lines of this labor militancy. And if you want to go to the next slide, from general strikes from the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, both on the East Coast and in California, where you see, the Spanish language flyer because most of the workers were Mexican. To the next slide, to the textile workers strike of 1937, which is one of the most significant and I think under talked about strikes in U.S. history, when hundreds of thousands of textile workers, from the up the East Coast down to the South went on strike. And then to the next slide, to even retail workers sit down strikes of, this is the Woolworth strike in 1937 in Detroit. Workers were really standing up for their rights. Mm-hmm. Emily, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything.
I do, and I'm sorry, I'm going to apologize because for some reason my internet keeps popping in and out, so I keep missing little chunks of things. So I think one thing I'd like to add, if we could just go back to that first slide.
Or that one, sorry.
That one, yeah, Ida Abelman's. I think this print tells us so much about what's going on in the 1930s, and I was really struck by it. And I was also impacted by, this print is made, is finished in 1937. It's called My Father's Father Reminisces. It struck me so much as kind of influenced by Diego Rivera's print, massive murals in Detroit, depicting the rise of industry. And you can just see so many different features. And I just thought it was interesting that to the left side of it, you have women in the front. Right, you have a woman in the front, kind of calling out the protesters and organizing, and then pulling the Statue of Liberty there, and then the pickets. If you can kind of see them up close, I was trying to kind of there's pickets that talk about women's right to vote and wages, and so these are even though when we think about labor in the 1930s as being a very sort of masculine space, so many of these prints really highlight the role of women in a variety of different ways. throughout the 1930s.
And I would just say Ida Abelman is a very interesting artist in that her work for the WPA was very much in the same vein, very critical of society at that time, and in particular, the role of technology and how it affects human life and human workers. And in this particular print, she is referencing the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And so she kind of creates this really complex narrative using montage in a way. And so she starts on the left-hand side with these immigrants coming from various places to the United States. Yeah. And you have this ghostly figure of the Statue of Liberty, which shows the complexity of the American dream and whatever that might be. In addition to having this huge sewing machine foregrounded with, I don't know if you can see it or not, but there are workers being crushed underneath that sewing machine, which is great, which is really interesting. And then all the way to the right where you have these three fat cats, these three capitalist fat cats smoking their cigars, only concerned about their money. And some of the work, or some of the words that you may or may not be able to see, is also fight for unionism, smash the sweatshop, I think.
Yep.
So yeah, it's all of these different issues, compiled into one print. And she also, in the exhibition, which you can't see right now, she also created a work called Child Labor, and it's a depiction of children in the sewing factory and farming and agriculture. And she kind of creates this really smart and interesting S shape, which I think also references the dollar sign, and that people are making money off of child labor, and other prints. So Ida Abelman is a very, she's a great artist to highlight with these social issues.
Well, and I'm glad that you brought that up about the sweatshops, because, and if we want to go forward to the slide with Frances Perkins on it, your question was, what were, during the 1930s, what were some of the, oh, sorry, I think this might be.
I think it's further down.
Yeah.
There it is. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I feel like that one, Frances Perkins is the Secretary of Labor, for the most, from the mid-1930s into the 1940s. She's the first woman cabinet holder, in U.S. history, the longest Secretary of Labor in U.S. history. And she was the architect in a lot of ways, a lot of the programs that we're talking about. Like, she oversaw, right, the implementation of the WBA. She oversaw, laws that we now take for granted, like the Fair Labor Standards Act, which, is why we have a 40-hour work week. But the thing that really animated her in a lot of ways was, well, two things. One, she spent time in Chicago and she worked out of Hull House. But two, she witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire.
Exactly.
And that horrific event, right, in New York, where 146 people died in this terrible, industrial fire. And that those experiences, the kind of experiences that are depicted in the print, is what motivated her, right, to spend her life, trying to legislate some of these laws that we now, although I think you could ask the question, how many of us really do work a 40-hour work week now?
But we understand the work week to be 40 hours, right? There's an expectation like that. Our work day is supposed to be kind of like this is based on office work, but sort of 9 to 5, 5 days a week with a weekend, and all of that is really constructed in the 1930s under Frances Perkins, during the Roosevelt administration, after decades and hundreds of years of protest around fighting for the 8-hour day. And you see that showing up in different prints, that idea of the 8-hour day and the regulation of the workday. And like Stephanie said, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is this pivotal moment for Frances Perkins, who's already doing work around labor rights in New York State, but really drives the rest of her career, witnessing, essentially women throwing themselves out of a 9-story window in broad daylight in downtown Manhattan, right? So that would have an impact on anybody, and clearly it does on the artists as well. And some of the other programs, I mean, that also resonated around gender in the 1930s are programs like the Conservation Corps, Conservation Civilian Corps, right, which takes young men, typically unmarried young men, and puts them to work throughout the country, right, building what we now use as our state parks, and building the electrical system in the Tennessee Valley, and doing all sorts of work to build basically much of the technology we kind of take for granted today, and then sending those funds back to their families. And then the other program that I've become a little bit obsessed with lately is the Pack Horse Library Initiative, which sent women out into rural communities throughout Appalachia on horseback to distribute library books during the 1930s. And that program was seen as incredibly radical throughout the area, because there was a real fear that these women were spreading radical ideas, ideas of socialism and communism and women's rights, and because people really felt like they shouldn't have any other book in their home other than the Bible in many communities. And so here they were bringing in magazines and novels and history books. But all of these programs are so defined by gender and gender identity and the social construction of gender during the 1930s that I think the overlap is really fascinating, but all being driven by the same idea that families need income to survive during the Depression.
Mm-hmm. Right. May move on. Do you have anything else that you want to address on that, or can we move on to the next question?
Go ahead, move on.
Okay, great. Perhaps no single industry was more front and center to the burgeoning labor movement in the United States during the first few decades of the 20th century as mining, and as reflected by the number of prints having to do with mining in pressing issues. Often the story of mining and labor focuses on the stories of the men in the mines, yet women often played important and understudied roles in what have come to be known as the mine wars. And how did gender, labor, and mining intersect in the 1930s?
And and one of the things that I think is so striking about these prints, and if you want to go ahead forward to some of the mining prints, is that, and this is just, sorry.
No.
Real quickly. So what you see though is with all of the labor strikes and the advance of labor law, like, so right, for the first time, there's a law that people can actually form and join a union in, especially in the private sector. You see this huge increase that starts in the 1930s through the 1940s, where basically 1 out of 3 people who were workers were in a union, which, now it's, just over 10%. So it was a very different world that sometimes I think it's hard for us to imagine. So all of that, like, activity and protest actually had tangible results. And but going to the mining, I think it's striking just how much these prints really are speaking to what was going on in society at the time. So this is a really, I think, a really powerful picture of a miner who has been in an accident. And just in the 1930s, more than 13,000 people in the United States died in mining accidents. I mean, it was an incredibly dangerous industry, and a quarter of the nation's bituminous soft coal is in Illinois. So it was an incredibly important industry in Illinois. And so scenes like this would just have resonated, right, with the people in our state, would have resonated with, people in West Virginia or in different places, because it was their lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
If you might want to scroll through some of the other prints.
Okay. what I also think is interesting is that in this particular print, Michael Gallagher was not a miner. However, his brother and his father was. They mined in the anthracite mines in Pennsylvania. And so he had first-hand experience, or at least knowledge of what was going on in the mines. And what is interesting in this work is that you're not looking at miners who are tall, thin, slender. You're looking at these very strapping, muscular men. And there were a lot of artists, or I shouldn't say a lot, there were many artists who were politically affiliated with the Communist Party, or at least sympathized with them. Some of the artists in this exhibition were, whether they went to John Reed clubs or were card-carrying members of the Communist Party in the USA. However, I think different perspectives and different people read things differently. So in this particular instance, someone from the Communist Party may be looking at this as more of like the proletarian worker, and they really didn't depict women in this particular way. It was all about, male as laborer. Or if you looked at it in a different way, it could be the fact that that these mines are actually, they're not injuring people who can't take it. They actually are injuring these again, these really strong bodies, and it's still kind of, they're succumbing to those mines. Yeah, I don't know. I just think that this is, in particular, this is interesting that it's not just, it's condemning the industry in a way.
Yeah.
It is, but it's also, and you see this in the postal workers murals that, were painted at the same time. And I think too, part of it is, thinking about that this is a US government funded project, is that there is this desire to show the robust vitality of labor in the United States when that is very much in question, when, there's bread lines, and people, but this idea that, that US labor is strapping, that it's going to come back. And this, even in, something like this that shows, like you said, it's a tragic picture, but it's also showing the strength of the miners. And there is definitely an interest by these programs to sort of forward that. So it's these images are just very complicated to really, when you think about all the different sort of spaces that they're inhabiting.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think you're right. We want, the artist is depicting incredibly strong workers, and this idea of the powerful worker, and somebody who, sort of this idea that despite the fact that they're carrying somebody out, it's the mine that killed them, not their own bodies, right? But interestingly, this is made around 1935 when, in the midst of the Great Depression, like Stephanie said, there's bread lines, and there's a national meat boycott, where the narrative of that meat boycott is that men are not getting enough food, and in particular, they're not getting enough red meat to sustain their bodies to do exactly this kind of difficult, hard labor, right? So the narrative being created by the women during this time who are leading these kinds of food boycotts and trying to draw attention to the fact that families don't have enough money to put food on their table, and that in the midst of a depression, without any kind of regulation around food prices, the government policies like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, as well as the industry, the meat industry itself, are driving up the high cost of food. And so how is it possible for a miner such as this to actually sustain that body, right? In the midst of the depression, when people are not even, when the expectation is that you should have a meat on the table for each meal, or at least for dinner, that's not possible, right? And there's all sorts of, there's, writers, John Updike writes a short story about this. There's fiction, short stories and novels that are coming out around food and how people are being deprived of food, and in particular, how that's impacting the male worker. not, you know, and the ripple effect that that then has on the family. The other thing I wanted to add to this is, if you flip to the next slide, is just this, how violence is depicted. Because you have two scenes here of, you know, death. The first one that we were just looking at, right? Clearly, the narrative is that this man has died from something within the mine, you know, some injury from the mine. But this one, where you see protesters and the mine security forces or police have, you know, the image depicts the murder of a protesting miner, right? So mining is dangerous because the work itself is dangerous, but it's also dangerous because if you want to have a good wage and hours and health and safety, you're putting your body between the mine owner's police force and the workforce. And so you see that, you know, that depicted here, which I think is also incredibly powerful. I mean, that's what the mine wars really are. And then in Illinois, it becomes even more complicated with two rival unions battling one another for representation within the mines. And so you have another layer of violence onto that.
Right.
Steph, you looked like you were going to say something.
No, yeah, I was going to say that's in, you know, in the 1930s is sort of the peak. Like when people talk about the 1930s and mining in Illinois, they call it the mine wars. And it was between the workers and the mine owners, but also between these two. And, you know, if you go down to Southern Illinois, and, you know, I've done this several times, they'll tell you which, like, old timers will go house by house and be like, they were part of this, they scabbed for the company, they were part of this union, and like the memory is so deep. And if you want to scroll forward, I think a couple of slides, there's a really powerful picture of the mine workers' wives. Just go back one to the, sorry, one more, yeah, to the mine workers' wives. And what is frequently not talked about is that women also played a really important role, and especially with the Progressive Mine Workers of America. The next slide, I'm sort of becoming, a little bit obsessed with Agnes Burns-White. She is this woman in Southern Illinois who is part of the Progressive Workers of America. She helps form the Women's Auxiliary to the mine workers, and she helps lead in January of this year, of 1933, this march on the Capitol of women. And they all have on these white headbands and these like long black skirts, and there's between 8,000 and 10,000 women. And they, you know, march to the governor's house, and they're basically saying, you know, they're asking for fair treatment in the mines. They're trying to bring to light some of the violence that they're facing in the community, but they also have demands like, we need unemployment insurance. Like we need, you know, the ability to put the kind of thing that Emily's talking about, food on the table, you know, during these economic downturns, and that women were often sort of leading those conversations in some ways, and especially on the front lines of protests and pickets, when sometimes there would be injunctions so that the men couldn't participate, that kind of thing. And that's not unique to Illinois. I mean, that happens throughout mining history. But
Illinois has the largest number of, I mean, we think of Appalachia as like this huge mining area, but Illinois, correct me if I'm wrong, Stephanie, I mean, it has like one of the largest memberships of miners, unionized miners in the country. So, you know, Illinois was a central pivotal point, not to mention the fact that it also was kind of this gateway to the West, right? People coming through Chicago, and Chicago being seen as like the modern representation of industry and labor organizing. I mean, it's home to many of the first local unions. And so Illinois plays a really significant role in that sort of way that the mine wars play out. And then I think it's the next slide, we have Mother Jones, is that? So Mother Jones, who is, you know, a better known advocate of the miners than Agnes, although because she travels around the entire country, Agnes's narrative is mostly in Illinois. You know, Mother Jones is the Hellraiser. She travels all throughout the South, the West, up into Milwaukee, leads a children's march from Philadelphia to Long Island against child labor to Teddy Roosevelt's house, remakes herself in the second half of her life as a labor angel, basically, as a woman who is willing to go and stand between the industrialists, the mine owners, and the workers, and to push the workers to be more militant and not to be afraid of the owners, and is repeatedly thrown in jail in multiple states, is thrown out of states, thrown out of Colorado before during the Ludlow mine strike, and ends up being buried here in Illinois in Mount Olive. This is her monument in the Mount Olive Cemetery, which is the only Union cemetery in the state, in the nation. And it was built by the mine workers, because was built by the Progressive Mine Workers of America, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not the Mine Workers Union. So that was an interesting distinction, because miners were not permitted to be buried in their towns because of their organizing activism. So they ended up building their own cemetery. And so we often take our students, our adult students that we teach through the labor education program, which is the next slide, to the Mother Jones monument. So this is one of our classes. Which year is this? This is 2019.
Yeah, 2019.
Yeah, pre-pandemic. Do you want to talk about this slide?
Yeah, so you mentioned in our bios that we both teach we both are co-directors of what's called the Regina V. Polk Women's Labor Leadership. This is a program where we go down to Southern Illinois with current rank and file union members that are women, and it's a 4-day program where we teach them about labor history, the labor movement, and how to develop their own leadership within their unions. And one of the things that we do is we bring them on a field trip to Mount Olive to visit this memorial, and everybody reads different quotes from Mother Jones. She had, some really fantastic quotes. You could see some of the women are holding them up. And we always take our picture, and it's always one of the highlights of the program. But, and I think that's one of the things, monuments, some of the prints that that we're talking about now, these visual representations connect us to this labor past and the labor story, and preserving them and letting people see them is so important for us to understand where we are today in terms of our labor rights. And we still have more work to do. I really like that quote. I'm told I'm a dangerous citizen, and you can bet I am a dangerous citizen, and I'm glad I am. So yeah.
I will say, I'm not sure if everyone knows this or not, but during the WPA, the artists were paid for their time. They were given a weekly stipend, and when they produced their prints, they were printed in an edition of 25, or around 25. Sometimes they didn't print the whole edition. The artists were given a few copies each. And these editions were then sent out into the world to libraries, to hospitals, to schools. They were also shown and distributed in exhibitions that the Federal Art Project actually organized. And so these prints were actually seen by everyday people all the time. I don't know if miners actually saw these depictions, which, unless the artists, when they were doing their drawings, if they were on site, like Harry Gottlieb was, unless he showed the miners. But it's interesting to think about how they were also interpreted back then as well, and as how we can understand that history and how far we've come today. But I just wanted to interject that a bit.
Yeah, and if I can just kind of follow up on a piece, you talked about a print that is not in this PowerPoint slide was it of children? It was agriculture and something side by side. What was it?
So it's in the shape of an S. On the top, there are young girls who are sewing at a sewing.
Okay, that's right.
It's in the background. And then on the bottom, there are two young men picking harvesting food.
So, you know, the other quote here we see is racism is the game that has been played by the ruling class to divide the working class. This must stop. And I think what's especially powerful about that quote is that, you know, while there were, you know, hundreds of thousands of people protesting, and we did get, you know, the Wagner Act in the 1930s, and many other programs, there were some real compromises that were made that were driven by racism, right? So the Wagner Act was passed, but it specifically excluded workers who, I mean, it did include workers who were in the public sector, which was still smaller at that point, but it also excluded agricultural workers and people who worked in homes, so domestic workers, but also that would have included, you know, textile workers who are doing home work or piecework in their home. And so in the 1930s, just as today, that would by and large mean brown and black people were excluded essentially from labor law, despite the fact that they were working for private employers, right? So if you want to move to the next slide, you know, the next several slides depict, you know, this kind of, so, you know, homework, this could or could not, you know, this is a factory, but if you go to the next slide before this one,
Oops, sorry.
you know, no, the other way, sorry. You know, this slide I really see as a woman working in her tenement, right? But in the background, you can kind of see the rows of clothing, right? So she would have been taking work home, working in their tenement, and then taking that, you know, bringing that work back to the factory, right? So maybe she would have worked in the factory and at home. The previous one, which is the laundry workers, would have, you know, maybe they would have been working in a larger industrial laundry, or they would have been taking laundry home. In the South, you would have had predominantly Black women doing laundry work, you know, out of their own homes or in a communal laundry that would have been likely excluded from, you know, that ability to organize a union. And so the intention there was numerous, right? One, we don't want Black and brown people organizing into a union. Two, we certainly don't want Black and brown people building solidarity with white people, because then that means the working class, which is much, much, much larger, right, than the ruling class, can do some serious organizing. And so I think these three slides are particularly powerful if you understand that history of the fact that a lot of these workers that are depicted are likely excluded from, you know, that bump in unionization that we see in the 1930s. However, in the 1940s, when we go to war, there is this brief opportunity where, especially women of color, Black women are given, you know, are given the opportunity to leave that laundry work or that textile work and go work in munitions factories or other kinds of factories, not without a lot of protest to make that happen against the federal government with threats of protest. They usually had the bottom rung jobs in those industries, but nonetheless, we're moving out of, you know, homework and domestic work and laundry work into better paying manufacturing jobs for a temporary time period. Of course, the war ends and women, white and Black and brown, lose those jobs, obviously, after the war is over. But
well, and Emily, I'm glad that you brought that up, because the legacies of that sort of decision to sort of bifurcate the labor movement in terms of the jobs that have robust labor protections and the jobs that don't, right, are still with us. And they're still with us in very gendered ways. I mean, there's a reason why the COVID pandemic has disproportionately impacted workers of color and women, that they are more likely to lose their jobs and they're more likely to die because of exposure on their jobs, because of the work sectors that women and workers of color are still pushed into, right, have less robust labor protections than other sectors. And, you know, that they don't have unions, service workers don't have unions by and large in this country to advocate for them. And you know, we're talking about the 1930s, when sort of the bedrock of labor policy in this country was passed, and I would argue, you know, has not been updated in the ways that it should have been, as our economy switched from a mostly industrial economy to a more service sector economy to now what is increasingly becoming a gig economy, and the labor law hasn't kept up with it. But that legacy of gendered and racial discrimination is what we're living with today, and why we are still seeing some populations being more vulnerable. The pandemic, I think, is shining a spotlight on issues that have been going on, for more than a century in terms of labor.
Yeah, I mean, and let's be real, like the gig economy for Black and brown workers has always existed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Black and brown workers have been consistently working in what we now call a gig economy. It now impacts tons and tons of white people, right? So it has a name now and gets a lot more attention, but and it's obviously much larger, and it's more complicated than that. But if you look at generations of workers that are Black and brown, folks who had enslaved folks in their families background, you move to sharecropping, you move to piecework. I mean, that is the gig economy. That is unstable, poorly paid work, right? That offers no labor protections. So, I think that's a really important piece. If we want to move to the slide 24, which is just the sketch I included, I think it's that one. One of the reasons I wanted to include this sketch, it's a cartoon that comes from the 1940s. The Auto Workers Women's Auxiliary had this sketch in one of their newsletters early on, and it's about 1942. And what I like about this sketch is that oftentimes when we think about organizing in the 1930s, we put the factory, which you see to the left with the smokestacks, at the center of our narrative. Like the factory and the workplace is at the center. But what women understood, and I think also I would argue what communities of color have understood, is that in fact the home is really the centerpiece. The home is where the income and the wages come in and then go back out again. The home is where you establish your community, right? So the women's auxiliaries understood this, that if you put the home at the center and then radiating out from that is, the workplace with the union hall and the store and your, house of faith and the city hall and the school and all of those other pieces that you see together, that's really that's how organizing should be centered. But so often in the labor movement, I think understood this in the 30s to a certain degree because they got pressure from, the Communist Party and socialists and different immigrant communities that were organizing based on, from their actual ethnic organizations rather than from their workplace, right? I mean, the UAW, when they were organizing, General Motors and Ford had organizing committees based on language, right? There was the Polish organizing committee, and there was the Black organizing committee, and there was the women's organizing committee, and there was the Spanish speaking and the Italian speaking organizing committees, because they understood that you had to organize based on race and gender and language and immigrant status. The labor movement kind of pushed that off to the side by the late 40s when they'd had this 1 in 3 number. When we got to 35% union density, there was this sense that we're now, part of the economic system that drives America. And so this model of organizing that we see here was cast aside, which I think if you look at like the long history of labor and organizing is a huge problem in the strategies, because now a lot of unions, especially unions that represent service sector workers, have gone back to this organizing model of putting family and home at the center rather than the workplace. The next slide, if we go back to talking about the food shortages in the 1930s, this is Mary Zuck, who was the 1935 boycott leader of the meat boycotts that I mentioned when we were talking about mining. And while she started organizing in Hamtramck, she became a national figure in the 1930s around the high cost of food and the high cost of living. And this is how a lot of women got their organizing start before they started organizing in unions within the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And so I always like to give her a shout out, because her moment of time was bright for a while and then dimmed out, and she kind of falls out of the narrative, unfortunately, as do many women, right? Many of the women we're talking about we don't have names for them. We just have images of them, but we know that they were doing this organizing. We just can't follow their archival trail very easily. But Mary Zuck is one of those women that can be talked about. And I think the next couple slides are just some images of various protests. This is, you know, downtown Hamtramck during the 1935 meat boycott. This is another image of Mary Zuck, who goes on to run for city council and is the first woman elected to the Hamtramck City Council. And then I think the next slide, yeah, is a organizing campaign with a young Walter Reuther, who becomes kind of the legendary UAW president into the 1970s. This is him as a young man handing out organizing flyers to the Women's Auxiliary. Yeah, so just some other images. And this final slide is a Detroit Housewives League, which is an African-American organization of women who are doing very similar organizing in Detroit and across the country around high cost living, although often been segregated from the labor movement. So similar kinds of narratives, stories and protests around the high cost of food. But I found very little evidence, at least in Detroit, of overlap with the two, with both the sort of women's auxiliaries of the labor movement and the Housewives Leagues, which is attributed, of course, to the deep segregation in the North, and specifically Detroit.
And I just wanted to say that's really interesting. I love the sketch that shows that the home is at the center. In the 1930s, specifically in the WPA, you see a lot of artists depicting women in the domestic sphere. That's oftentimes women are just depicted in that scene. And what I wanted to do with this exhibition was actually find women being active. They could still be in the domestic, but actually doing labor, active in a certain way. And I found that it was primarily when that was actually happening, like the woman hunched over her sewing machine. That's by Reva Helfand. The sleeve pressers with the African-American women all in their white uniforms, that was also a woman. And you usually don't see, and I should say, if you do see a woman in some kind of sweatshop or industry scene, oftentimes her back is to the viewer. So she's there, but she's not really acknowledged.
Right.
And so I wanted to show that yes, I mean, women were a vital part of the economy in the 1930s. And they were really, you start to understand more that women workers were also, you know, fighting against this masculinity that, you know, male workers, and how married women couldn't get a job if their husbands were unemployed. They just couldn't do it. Or they had a really hard time finding employment if their husband was unemployed. So in these particular images, I thought they're just really great interiors. I mean, this is by Bernard Chart, and she's at home, but she's working. But I think that this is a very different scene than Reva Helfand's, as she's toiling and she's in anguish and she's just working just to get by. So yeah, anyways, but you don't find a lot of prints of women as active laborers, and also minorities with Black and brown laborers. You don't see a lot of those either. And I was listening to a really interesting podcast the other day about the New Deal, and they were speaking with a gentleman who I don't know if he actually was old enough to work in the WPA or if his father had, but he was talking about his experiences or about experiences that the New Deal didn't really affect African Americans because they didn't get anything taken away. It was the white workers, it was the white laborers. And I find that really fascinating when you start to think who is actually depicted in these prints and who these prints were for. Anyway, just thought I would throw that out there. So We're getting to the hour point. Do you have anything else you want to mention, Stephanie or Emily?
Not only that, thank you for doing this exhibit. I mean, it's really, the prints are just amazing. And I think we were saying this right before we opened up, with just, when we think about the current moment in time that we're in, where people are, where we have this astronomically high rate of unemployment, where families are struggling for childcare and balance their, if you have the luxury to be able to work from home, and then the privilege of getting to help your child with e-learning while you're also working from home, et cetera, that our government currently can't even make up their mind about, like, sending a several $100 check to families, when during the 1930s, I mean, as flawed as many of these programs were creating government-funded programs to fund artists and laborers and other folks to bring money home, is something that, I think deserves this attention, and with its flaws and all. So thank you just for putting such a great exhibit together, and as well as this forum.
Yeah, and I think that thinking about how these prints reflect our understanding of work, and I think frequently, when we were asked to do this talk, and we have this conversation about, like, what is gender and labor in the 1930s? And again, I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. It's the Flint sit-down strikes, right? It's this sort of robust labor movement on the march that's often very white, often very male. But what if we expanded our view of labor to think about not just what's happening on the factory floor, but the kind of work that Emily's book does? Labor is also something that is very much done in the home, very much done by women every day, who are figuring out how to keep food on the table, how to keep their kids fed. And right now, in this moment, a lot of people are facing that same issue, that there's the work outside of the home, but also the work inside of the home, and how the two connect, and how race and gender inform that, is something that I think we as a society still are wrestling with, and as a society still haven't completely figured out. I was thinking about, if we had a different government, that valued the arts, and valued putting people back to work, and we ran a program like this today, what would be the images, right? I mean, I think, we might have images of grocery workers, or, frontline workers. We definitely would have images of doctors, right? But would we also have images of, a harried mother who is, works in the corporate world on a Zoom trying to juggle her students? What would murals like labor be today? I think, and what is the fact that we don't have sort of these robust programs, right? In the future, in another 90 years, what kind of program would they be able to do? Because we aren't investing in sort of these images. And even though, like you said, maybe some of the images are, they're depicting certain things and maybe leaving other things out, right? Like the women's whose backs are turned. And how do we figure out how to get them to face, not just face, the camera, or face the artist in our art, but also in our policy. Is something I think that the labor movement still, frankly, hasn't figured out.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. Well, thank you. Liza,
Thank you.
I can stop sharing my screen, but Liza, do you have any questions? Or anyone have questions?
Yeah, so the only question, and I guess you guys are both kind of getting into this right now, that were gathered from the registration forms are, what does this current situation look like in relation to the history, and what can we do now? I think there are at least 2 questions in the registration form that really we're asking questions out of a need in the current moment? How do we fight injustices right now? And asking for help in a lot of ways. So I think it's great that this exhibition is put forth into the community so that we can start having these conversations. And I don't know if Stephanie and Emily, you would be comfortable with people reaching out to you. I don't know. I don't know who has the answers or where I should necessarily point people, but it feels urgent and yeah.
Right, and if we don't have that embracing government, it has to be on the community level, right? There needs to be these little pockets of groups, you know, addressing what's happening at this moment and trying to encourage the youth and everyone else to really address these issues and fight for progress, I think. But yeah, we're not getting that with this current administration. So I think it just goes back to starting small and being mighty and continuing forward, I think. I don't know, I don't have any good question or good answers.
Well, and I think that too, I mean, and you know, when you think about like the Roosevelt administration, yes, they implemented policies and, you know, he came in and was, you know, with a mandate to implement policies. But a lot of the policies that were implemented were because people were in the streets. I mean, it was responsive to one of the biggest strike waves in the history of the United States. It was responsive to on the street organizing. It was responsive to people making demands. It was responsive to social movement organizing. They didn't just wake up one day and say, you know, we're going to give labor rights or we're going to have the 40-hour work week. People died for it. People fought for it and they died for it and they organized for it. And that's where those policies came from. And so, you know, I mean, that sort of action of putting pressure on the government is still very, very important. And I think that sometimes, I think that's why I really like that, you know, you have some of those prints that show that activity, because it's a really important part of the history.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not quite sure what else we should say, or if we should just, this was really great conversation. I can't thank you and you, Stephanie and Emily, enough. This has been
Happy to do
fantastic.
it.
Thank you so much for having us. This is very enjoyable.
Yeah. And again, I wish we could
Yeah.
all be here in person. But yeah, we'll see.
And for folks that are local, they can go and see the exhibit.
They can. So we are taking every precaution. I don't have my mask on right now because the gallery is actually blocked off. But we encourage people to do time tickets. We're free. It's not really, but registering in advance for a particular time. However, we will take people just coming in. And in each of the gallery, there is a maximum amount of occupancy. And so, people can come in during our open hours. There are hand sanitizer stations throughout. People can come in.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And if anyone's interested, I'm teaching a 2-session labor history class later this month via Zoom.
Oh, yeah.
So you can always go to the School of Labor Employment's website or email me, and I'm happy to share that information. But I think I might actually have my students take a look at the exhibit online, because I think I don't know, I'm trying to think of some interesting, hands-on projects we can do via Zoom. So this has given me some thoughts. So, but yeah, if you want more labor history in your life, you can always sign up for my class.
Great.
All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.